Eric, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Hi, everyone. I am Zani Voss. Thank you so much for joining us today. And a big thank you to Eric and to NASA for the very generous invitation to be here with you. Um, we're going to be talking about the post-pandemic financial landscape of nonprofit arts and cultural organizations. You're probably going to be hearing a lot of different trends that resonate for you with organizations in your state. Perhaps others of you may be bucking the trend. But before we dive into trends, I want to just ground us in a topic from a really personal perspective. So I'm going to ask if you would use the little chat storm, and just share with colleagues here, who here has totally moved on from the pandemic? Totally moved on. And who's still feeling the lingering effects of the past 3 years in your personal life or in your professional work? And that can even be, have you changed any habits with respect to going out? Whether you've started doing something new, stopped attending something you used to do with regularity, or maybe you just don't go out as frequently. As much as we all want COVID to be a thing of the past, we're going to continue to feel the ripple effects of change for years to come, for better or for worse. So will the organizations that are our grantees. We're going to be posing questions at the end of this presentation, and we're going to be happy to respond to your questions. So I would encourage you to please get used to using the chat feature, or just raise your hand if you have questions and they come to mind. We want to keep this informal. So why are we here? Today we're going to focus on three kind of key takeaways, three key big issues. So as cultural organizations emerge from the pandemic better capitalized than ever before, many are experiencing a perfect storm of workforce crisis, disappearing relief funding, dwindling attendance, and rising costs. And balance sheets actually hide an emerging financial crisis. Organizations have to transform. They have to learn from change in response to unfavorable market trends. This change has to occur, though, as a collaboration between nonprofit leaders and their supporters. And when funders recognize that grantees know best what their communities need, the field can find new pathways to health. And sector-wide efforts to address funding inequities have led to financial improvements for many organizations of color. However, these groups will require sustained access to revenue and capital, given historical imbalances and inadequate access to community resources. I'm going to turn to Jen now, who's going to kick us off by sharing insights on the arts and cultural workforce. Jen?
Thanks so much, Sani. I'm going to start this picture of workforce health with a look at unemployment. Going back to the beginning of 2020, we can see here the blue line showing the level of unemployment in the arts and culture sector is almost always across this period of time above the red line, which is unemployment rates for the country as a whole. And that's really only changed since April of this year, just 6 months ago. And while I don't have it on the slide, I want to also highlight the fact that throughout 2022 and for all months of 2023, white respondents had unemployment rates roughly 0.5% below the sector unemployment rate overall, while people of color collectively averaged unemployment rates about 2.5% higher than that sector overall. Just showing really in stark contrast here the fact that people of color were disproportionately affected by unemployment in the sector. So we're going to flip the scale here and talk about employment. So here we generally want to see higher levels, right? And this is raw numbers of employees across the arts and culture sector. You can see the giant drop off happening in 2020, which came at the end of a long and slow gradual increase. And this was interesting. When we pulled these numbers, we found that just this year in October, so just over about a month ago, had we actually reached parity with pre-pandemic levels of employment in the arts and culture sector. One other interesting note around this chart is the fact that performing arts companies have employment levels at this point about 10% higher than their pre-pandemic levels, whereas museums are right at pre-pandemic levels. They haven't just quite crossed that threshold, but are almost at it. So interesting to see really differential employment effects depending on the part of the sector that you are in. I also have a chart here, and this is again focused on employment levels that shows the fact that of those who are working in the US, that the sort of representation of BIPOC employees within the arts and culture workforce lags behind their representation in the US labor force as a whole. And this is relatively consistent across the pandemic. There are a few points where these numbers get close, but we consistently see that arts employment, even as it's returning to pre-pandemic levels, lacks equitable BIPOC representation. And then I just have one slide here that pulls a few key findings out of a study that was recently finished called Museums Moving Forward that studied 54 art museum workplaces looking at workforce satisfaction and intent to leave and workplace culture, and a few findings that I think connect to some of this employment data that we're looking at are the fact that here in the top bar, the ability to cover basic living expenses with a art museum salary wage is only in place for a few people. So 26% can always cover their basic living expenses through their museum salary alone. And then each of the other categories, sometimes, usually, or rarely, or never able to cover their expenses, just demonstrating the fact that living wages in art museums are still far away from many people. And that even if you're able to sort of hang in there and really hold on for a promotion, which would include a pay raise, that it takes a really long time to actually get that promotion within an art museum. So these two charts on the bottom are showing how many years it takes within an art museum to get a full promotion, split out by gender, by race, and ethnicity. So we see that on average, it takes 12 years in an art museum for a promotion, a full promotion, and that those rates vary really significantly depending on one's demographic characteristics. And perhaps not surprisingly, one last statistic, it's not on the slide here, is the fact that over 2/3 of art museum workers are considering leaving the field altogether. So I think looking across these statistics, we see some really challenging circumstances for individuals running arts and culture organizations and those working within them. So I'm going to turn it over as we shift to the financial picture to Zani to talk us through more details there.
Thanks, Jen. We're going to talk a bit about the financial context and the business model now. 3 years ago, all thought that the sky was falling, and it was falling. Earlier this year, earlier in 2023, with doors reopened, many people in the arts field anticipated a really quick return to better days, as exemplified in this quote. We were planning a return during COVID, thought it would come back to what it was, and it will never be back to what it was. If we know folks aren't coming back right away, especially for new works, how can we scale the operations and the execution of them? We're going to be diving into actually what is happening and what did happen, kind of a look in the rearview mirror alongside some current information. The data that both Rebecca Thomas and I are going to share comes from 2040 arts and cultural organizations around the country, 440 of which are BIPOC organizations. And these are organizations that completed SMU's cultural data profile each year from 2019 through 2022. As many of you know, this data has been historically required by many funders as a condition for grant making. And I do want to say a huge thank you to those state agencies and their grantees who participate. A few more points about just kind of the methodology. How did we approach this trend analysis? The conclusions that we are going to draw from the data come primarily from analyzing median data. So the median being just the midpoint in a range of a sample. And reported this way because averages in the sample are distorted by a really small subset of organizations that skew conclusions in a way that overstates the health for the majority of the sector. And to isolate resources in each year, we look at trends in unrestricted operating revenue streams. These are the most flexible funds. They support both programmatic activity and day-to-day running of the organization, both of which are really essential. Inflation. It has not only a very real effect on the cost of producing, presenting, exhibiting art, operating organizations, but it also creates the kind of economic uncertainty that makes people not want to, or perhaps not able to spend as much money as they once did. So this means that organizations need to bring in more income over time just to keep up. What cost $100 in December of 2019 cost $115 in December of 2022. So the buying power of every dollar has to be adjusted in order to maintain the same operating level. And so for this reason, the financial growth figures that we show are going to reflect a 15% adjustment for inflation. I think the big headline is that most organizations studied weathered the pandemic better than expected in some respects, but that financial challenges are emerging and threaten the sector's stability. So let's look at revenue. Here we see median unrestricted operating contributions by year, and they rose 35% since 2019. And yet when we consider inflation, the real buying power of that revenue growth adjusts down to 17%. During the height of the pandemic, public and private institutional supporters, the green and the purple lines, offset some of the substantial losses in earned revenue. And you can see the substantial rise in especially government support that was skyrocketing between 2019 and 2021. So government support, as we reflected, is a kind of combo of federal, state, and municipal support. It provided the greatest lifeline. It rose an inflation adjusted 93% for the median organization over the 4-year period. So that's not talking about those who skewed it even higher. It's just the median. It was the driver of revenue for growth. Foundation funding did rise 8% over the period, but its impact was muted by cost pressures. So if we adjust accordingly, foundation giving, its power to support expenses fell 6% in inflation-adjusted figures. Foundation funding isn't a driving factor in propping up the sector in any given year, at least not for a majority of the organizations. Giving from trustees and other individuals, the orange lines, it was virtually flat over time in nominal terms, meaning that growth fell short of inflation by 12%. Now, our partners at TRG Arts, it's an arts marketing consulting firm. We get quarterly updates from them, kind of finger on the pulse, what's happening in terms of ticket purchases and gifts. Their data, it tends to skew to medium and large performing arts organizations. They recently released an update on the recovery status of U.S. gifts and ticket sales through October of 2023, so just a month ago. There were 10% fewer gifts at these organizations in October of 2023 than in 2022, and gift revenue was 29% lower. So smaller gifts being made by fewer people. Recovery in individual gifts, it began stalling out in about this past summer of 2023, and didn't see the June to October surge that they saw in 2021 and 2022. And if we look at this chart and just look at the last two bars, the 2021 to 2022, so what's happened most recently, the more recent trends show an emerging weakness in the business model of organizations. Institutional giving pulling back, foundation and government pulling back from pandemic heights for a majority of groups. It's as you would expect, given the tremendous influx that went in during the pandemic times. But the pullback really comes at the wrong time, given all of the other headwinds. Unrestricted individual giving appears to be holding up a little better, increasing 5%, which was still short of the surge in inflation and not really a big part of revenue for small groups. So let's look at trends for the other side of the coin in revenue, earned revenue and attendance. The trends related to in-person attendance, which are the blue bars, and the purple trend lines are earned revenue. And this is earned revenue that comes from delivering programs. It took a big hit compared to where it stood at the start of the pandemic. As people stopped coming and subscriptions continued their long-standing descent. In fiscal year 2022, the median organization reported 42% fewer in-person participants and a 30% inflation-adjusted decline in earned revenue compared to 2019. Attendance increased fourfold in 2022 as doors reopened for over 2021. You're likely saying, hey, Zani, okay, that was then. You're showing 2022. Aren't we now in the second half of 2023 doing a whole lot better? Haven't the positive reversal trends continued? And again, from our partners at TRG Arts, we understand that ticket woes continue. As recently as last month, compared to 2019 for the same period, October 2023 sales were down 20% and ticket revenue was down 5%. And as they say in the report, Sales were beating 2022 until July, but have since failed to keep up with the last year. So that momentum dropped and the wind in the recovery sales has since stalled. And it's an important thing to understand, even as there's kind of hope on the horizon that things will get back to normal. It's not coming back nearly as quickly as anyone anticipated. So that's revenue. I'm going to pass it to Rebecca to talk about costs, bottom line, and working capital.
Thanks, Donnie. Hi, everyone. So business models are comprised of revenue, costs, and the bottom line, whether there's a surplus or a deficit. First, I just want to speak about the cost side of the equation. We all already know that cultural organizations did so well financially during the pandemic because they cut their costs substantially at the same time that extra philanthropic revenue was coming in the door. But this changed starting in 2022 as organizations either reopened or resumed full programming, as the sector for the most part went back to business as usual. And yet organizations reopened amidst significant inflationary pressures, as Zani alluded to. Production, rent, people, you name it, everything became far more expensive. And to stay competitive, many organizations began to address long-standing gaps in pay equity. They raised salaries because it was the right thing to do, given so much historical underinvestment, and they raised salaries to retain people, staff and artists. The budget increases you can read here, but as you can see, they've been significant. Of course, these numbers are off of a depressed base, right? 2022 compared to 2021 represents a significant increase off of a very low expense basis. But the headline expenses are still up substantially from pre-pandemic times, and they still need to be offset by commensurate revenues. I think it's worth quickly mentioning that while arts organizations experienced dramatic budget increases over the entire 4-year period, they didn't spend out of line with the rest of the economy. When we take into account that 15% of inflation increases over a 4-year period, total expenses and total people costs actually fell, right? In fact, people costs adjusted for inflation are down around 11% since 2019. And that tells us that a human capital crisis still persists despite recent spending by arts organizations, despite these recent increases. Still, right, organizations are feeling the impact of rising costs, whether they're keeping up with inflation or not. And recent trends, in my opinion, are likely not sustainable for many arts organizations, given the declines in attendance that Zani just shared with us. The next slide. So when we ask, is the arts business model healthy? The barometer that we pay attention to is surpluses, revenue minus costs. We want to know how consistent are surpluses? Are they big enough? And do we see evidence of either chronic deficits or emerging weaknesses? This chart looks complicated, but stick with me for a moment. I'm going to explain it slowly. First, what this chart is doing is breaking out bottom line performance by budget size. So you have small organizations represented on the left and larger organizations represented on the right. First, what I want to point your attention to is the solid blue line. That's the median organization's bottom line performance. What this tells you, when you look just at those solid lines, is that a majority of cultural organizations in every size range remained profitable throughout this period. The impact of declining earned revenues and rising costs remained somewhat muted even in 2022. Margins were very healthy for the largest groups at that 9%, but they were pretty solid across the board at 4% or higher. However, there's always a however. Within each size grouping, there is a very large range of performance. So in addition to looking at the surplus size of organizations at the midpoint, we also want to examine the stronger and the weaker performers in each size category. The chart shows here that 25% of the sector, represented by the top dotted lines, has performed with very sizable profit margins. However, 25% of the sector is doing as badly or worse than the bottom dotted lines in each chart. So if you read that chart just on the left for a moment, that tells you that 25% of small groups had a deficit of 11% or more in 2022. Those are pretty big losses. Across the board, what those bottom dotted lines tell us is that deficits are customary and that deficits are growing for more than a quarter of the sector. The reason I like this chart is that it teases out a story of haves and have-nots, which you just don't really see when you look strictly at medians or at averages. And when these kinds of large deficits happen year after year, they begin to affect cash levels. So let's look then at the balance sheet, which is where we see liquidity. Readily available cash is critical right now as organizations enter an uncertain period, as they confront unanticipated losses, and as they try to pivot in response. The metric we're looking at here is working capital, the cushion that is available to nonprofit managers to pay their bills on time, to manage the unexpected, to take care of their fixed assets, and to grow or change. This metric excludes endowments, it excludes restricted funds for future years, which may be important for some organizations, but which are not typically accessible in times of need like the present. So working capital is a pretty conservative way at looking at the flexible liquidity on hand among our arts and culture organizations. In order to compare organizations, we're looking at months of working capital relative to costs. On the top, you have 2019 data, on the bottom, 2022 data. Moving from left to right, we show ranges of working capital. So those organizations on the left have negative liquidity, and the ones on the far right have more than a year of liquidity. And we say how many organizations, what percentage of organizations are represented in each range. The bottom line here, working capital remains elevated right now at levels that we haven't seen in recent history, right? In 2019, that top set of charts, almost 50% of organizations had less than 2 months of liquidity. By 2022, that bottom chart, that percentage fell to 20%. In the most recent year for which we have data, 46% of organizations had more than 6 months of liquidity. That's all that temporary funding, all that pandemic relief funding that is still, at least as of the end of 2022, sitting on balance sheets. So we still see here that have versus have not story, not quite as prominent as we saw with the surplus data, because it takes some time to see the impact of emerging deficits on overall cash. That said, we still have 20-25% of the field in a very precarious position. And we know from anecdotal data, from my portfolio, from conversations I'm having with arts leaders across the country, that this is all headed in the wrong direction, right? Deficits are getting larger and liquidity is starting to come down. What I want to do now is talk just for a quick moment about how business model and balance sheet trends are playing out specifically among organizations of color. During the pandemic, the data tells us quite encouragingly that BIPOC groups further benefited from a shift toward more equitable institutional funding. The talk about addressing equity appears to be showing up in funding patterns. Whether you look at contributions overall, funding from public agencies, funding from foundations, all increased more significantly for BIPOC groups than for organizations that don't identify in that way. Will this be fleeting? Was this a pandemic trend? Is it a real shift toward a democratization of practice? It's simply, I think, too soon to know, but this is very encouraging. The one place where we're not seeing strength is in individual giving. right? And I think that's probably not too surprising given what we know about many BIPOC organizations' lower access to community wealth from audiences who can buy tickets and from wealthy donors. The last point I just want to make on this slide is that BIPOC groups did appear to use some of this new funding to expand their budgets and to invest in their people. And they did so at a faster rate than non-BIPOC groups. This is really important because for so long, so many of these groups have not had the opportunity to invest in their staff and to pay for important infrastructure. And yet I think it's also worth remembering that these organizations have a long way to go to approach the average size of predominantly white-led and white-serving arts organizations. The data tells us that the median BIPOC group is 30% smaller than the median non-BIPOC group. So a lot more investment would need to occur for there to be equality in funding. This chart looks at those liquidity trends. BIPOC is represented by the pinky red chart and non-BIPOC groups by the light blue turquoise chart. What we see here is that BIPOC groups tend to be more liquid than non-BIPOC groups. And this was actually true, not just in every year, but in years before the pandemic. And you can even see how the differential began to widen in 2022 in ways that were favorable to BIPOC groups as those funding flows started to pick up. BIPOC groups tend to spend less than they save. They are more likely to run surpluses. When I first saw this data 5, 6, 7 years ago when we started tracking it, it surprised me. How can you reconcile higher levels of liquidity with what we know are funding inequities that have persisted for many decades? What I will say is that the data that you see here does not point to financial health per se, so much as to conservative financial management. BIPOC groups tend to be smaller, not always, but often. Smaller groups have an easier time adapting their costs to changing revenue realities. They don't have as much fixed labor. They may not even be able to pay their staff at all. They often don't own their buildings, and therefore they can be more nimble. They can nip and they can tuck to save when times are tough. I've also observed personally that BIPOC leaders tend to be disciplined financial managers. They've had to get by with less for much of their entire organizational existence. And so they know by and large how to conserve cash because they've had to. So this liquidity is obviously a good thing, but it reflects a history and a set of constraints that don't point to overall institutional health. And then just quick summary here, the liquidity data tells us that BIPOC groups have a strong track record of living within limited means, despite a lack of equitable investment. And I would argue that this makes them better equipped to handle higher levels of funding, despite any preconceived notions to the contrary. And yet, right, they've oftentimes achieved moderately better financial health at great cost by sacrificing spending on people, on systems, on infrastructure, as you can see reflected here, right? Organizations of color often rely on lean, underpaid staff, sweat equity. They may not be able to hire staff in marketing and in development, even though those are the areas that would help them raise more revenue to support their future growth. Instead, they are relying exclusively in many cases on volunteers, on donated spaces, which are never free and which oftentimes need to be made to work. Systems for data collection, analysis, reporting, you name it, are often inadequate, which can undermine fundraising efforts and make it very difficult to manage the finances from day to day. And so financial health metrics really, I think, do need to be understood within this much, much larger context. Oops, Zani, I think you're.
Yes, you think I'd know by now. We have three questions that we'd like to throw out to this group, and before kind of diving into them, I'm going to put them in the chat. I'll leave them up for just a second. But I'd like to ask if we could do, just using the raise hand function, a show of hands. For how many of you do the trends and the information that we presented today kind of ring true for what you know of what's going on with the arts organizations in your state? Getting some folks raising hands, a lot of folks raising hands. Well, to that end, I'm curious to know, how has your state agency responded to emerging business model pressures? So knowing that this is going on, what are you doing in response to these pressures? Is anyone willing to share? George, is that your hand up in willingness to share from Wisconsin? No?
Don't be shy.
No, it was just the speed of getting the hand down.
Well,
I will say, I mean, part of it is empathy at this point. Being out there in the field and talking with people and empathizing with what they're doing and connecting them to resources that are outside of our agency, because we're not getting additional resource to help in that respect. So that's part of it. And part of it is giving people permission to consider the exit option. Sometimes they need to be told that, it would be okay to fold up right now if you needed to, because the guilt is high.
And to Jen's point with respect to the research, are you hearing a lot of folks who are experiencing stress and burnout given these business model trends?
We just did a town meeting in Racine, Wisconsin yesterday, and would have expected to hear a lot more of that. But I think they were putting on a brave face. And some of it is organizations that haven't been supported in the past are new to the conversation. And therefore, they're not expecting the models that are existent to help them. And they're looking both around in the community and outside of the arts for support of what they're doing, whether it's working with schools or creative aging or community development, whatever it is. They're looking for other sources to supplement what the arts councils may or may not have been able to do in the past.
So in some respects, it's kind of forcing new exploration of resources, new exploration of networks.
Forced innovation.
Forced innovation. Well, I put the questions up there in the chat. A second question is, how can state arts agencies change how they operate to meet this moment? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts, but I'm going to ask Jen a question. Jen, SMU Data Arts research shows that local arts agency funding, so not state but local, it has a direct positive impact on arts vibrancy along a variety of different factors, but particularly number of artists, number of arts employees per capita. And in thinking about the relationship of that to your museums moving forward research, where career advancement opportunities, level of pay really stand out as areas of dissatisfaction among museum workers. And your point about a surprisingly substantial portion of workers say they want to leave their jobs. Do you think that there's a link between availability of public funding and reversing the tide of burnout and low pay? And kind of relatedly, what can grant makers do? What's within their power to do to help to alleviate some of that?
It's a great question, Zani. And I think that it depends, right? Like with so many things, I think that some organizations, when they get additional resources, hire more people and exponentially expand the number of things that they're trying to do and manage. And others can use it as a space or a buffer to give their staffs to staff up without expanding. But I think that idea of staffing up without expanding what's being offered is a really challenging one for many arts and culture organizations, that there's a sense that we always have to be doing more and more streams of things. And if you want to engage a new community, then you create a whole new set of offerings in addition to everything else that you've already done. And so I think funders can enter this conversation in terms of thinking, and I expect many on the call here are already doing this, but in terms of thinking a little bit differently about what metrics they want to see from arts and culture organizations. How much are you thinking about or valuing the extent to which organizations are reaching more people with fewer staff or resources? You know, what kinds of metrics are you prioritizing and are you asking them about? I think that sometimes organizations feel like they have to do more just in order to get more dollars through the door.
It seems like for so long, the mantra has been, you know, the low overhead, that organizations are rewarded when they spend more on programs and have very low overhead. And at the same time, we're seeing to keep that overhead low, you need to pay people less and have fewer people, which is really just burning through staff.
And we see that particularly, we saw that performing arts staff was higher, the 10% higher than pre-pandemic levels, but the inflation adjusted wages haven't kept up in a really substantial way in performing arts. That's true for museums too, but not quite as acutely. And so it's interesting to see more people being employed, but at lower levels of income. I want to ask too, Zani, a question came in from Carl. Here, I'm just going to scroll back up. In Pennsylvania, asking about whether or not there's any data related to perceived or actual pricing power for cultural products or services. And I know we've done some research about pricing and how that can or may not always move the lever.
Yeah, well, you know, what we're seeing, at least within the performing arts, is that organizations are charging more in terms of pricing. You know, the fact that ticket sales went down 20%, but ticket revenues only went down 5%. You know, just an indication of the extent to which organizations are trying to almost tax those who are coming. There are fewer people. So, I mean, you can look at it just from what is the elasticity? We're seeing fewer people coming and paying higher prices. We've not done research within the last few months about changes in perceptions about pricing, but I can tell you that we have been looking at other barriers. And you know, typically pricing is not the big smoking gun for why someone did or did not attend. Distance actually plays a huge role. We have really unrealistic expectations about how far someone will travel to attend within our own metroplex or within our own communities. We've done some research in this area, and we found that during the pandemic, as people are no longer traveling to downtowns, as people stayed home when they were, you know, in confinement, the perceptions about distance being a barrier are even greater now than they were before. So, you know, taking into account all of those different kinds of changes in consumer behavior that are now affecting whether or not people are going to be engaging with arts and cultural organizations, factor in perhaps to a greater extent than does price. And at the same time, the organizations are experiencing 15% inflation. You know, how can they not increase pricing somewhat to keep up with that, but at a time when people themselves don't have the same capacities within their own pocketbooks, given how inflation's affecting them personally? And thank you for the question. Distance from the cows. I mean, we see it in our own lives. We changed behaviors. We can't expect anything different from our audiences.
There's some interesting observations coming in through the chat too from a few different people about the wide range and variety with respect to some organizations really thriving right now and some cutting productions. And you know, what does that mean for the kind of support that you leverage as a state arts organization, given the variety that you're seeing? I know that's a theme that came up in the study that we recently did in Chicago as well.
Yeah, I mean, the organizations that seem to be struggling most at this point, at least in the recent study, and I'll pass it to Rebecca to answer as well. We worked with the Department of Cultural Affairs for the city of Chicago on an in-depth analysis of trends within that market. And it's the larger institutions that are suffering most. You know, as Rebecca pointed out, with BIPOC organizations, um, they have to be more nimble. They don't have as many fixed costs. They don't have as much fixed assets. Many of them are profoundly relevant to a local community to the extent that local communities weren't going to let them go out of business, whereas some of the larger institutions don't quite necessarily have some of the same in-depth meeting of immediate needs within a community that the smaller organizations do. Uh, you know, we're seeing some of that play out in the attendance numbers, which trickles down to just about everything else. Rebecca,
Yeah, and I'm seeing it in my portfolio very substantially among theaters, which I see it reflected. Laura's mentioned this in the chat a moment ago. It seems that of all the performing arts subsectors, theaters, at least the ones that I'm working with, and the ones we read about in the newspapers nationwide, are really, really having a hard time. And it's everything from COVID cases to disappointing attendance trends, disappointing events revenue, cost pressures. I mean, you name it. It seems that they're feeling it in a very acute way, and more of them are not just cutting parts of their season, they're actually going out of business or thinking about going out of business.
you know, it's a good time to bring up the fact that subscriptions were on the decline, you know, within the theater industry. Uh, the most recent peak year for subscriptions was 2004. They've been declining steadily ever since then. So part of it is just what are the moments in time where they really are catalytic, and even though something was going down, all of a sudden there's a steeper drop off. But it's not as though they were doing so great before. Uh, for a lot of the larger institutions, I see points being brought up about you know, increase of institutions unionizing with staff, pressure to increase hourly wages. You know, these are really critical points. I just spoke at a museum membership conference where there were so many museums saying that uh, they can't hire and keep really talented folks any longer. That employment shifted during the pandemic, and they're not competitive in terms of salary any longer. And once folks get into the institution, it's a stressful enough situation right now where people aren't sticking. And so when I think about, you know, as state agencies, what kinds of support might be offered for employees within the organizations. You know, we do care so much about how do the organizations relate to communities. Certainly one of the ways is through visitorship and attendance, but also the workforce, you know, is boundary spanning. These are the folks who live in the communities, and they're essential to the success of the organization.
It's true. In the Museums Moving Forward study, we saw that over a quarter of employees hired within the last 2 years had since left. So the immediate churn and the expense of constantly trying to replace a quarter of the workforce that you just hired is really challenging.
And we're seeing it a lot among two roles specifically, finance and fundraising. It feels like a lot of our clients aren't able to hold on to someone in finance and fundraising for more than a year at a time. And that fundraising position, I mean, it's always been subject to a lot of turnover, but when turnover accelerates in development, given the runway of building relationships and maintaining relationships and bringing in more revenue, I mean, it's really tough to build any momentum. And that's the one place now that performing arts organizations really need to hold. You know, that's the one place where the trends aren't as unfavorable as they are in other places. And so when you start to see the churn there, that's very concerning for the future outlook of contributed revenue.
And some of what we were talking about in terms of some organizations doing better than others, and where's the attention needed right now. You know, something that we've talked about, just Jen and Rebecca and myself, is how public funding has impacted in ways that private philanthropy can't. serving a different function. So the question of how can public agencies democratize arts funding and influence the support for BIPOC groups in a way that private philanthropy can't. I think of so many conversations I've heard recently from board members of large performing arts organizations, knowing that the organization is in crisis right now, of really thinking, yes, during the pandemic, we were about trying to fund smaller organizations and making contributions to arts organizations of color. And yet, right now, we just need to take care of ourselves. And we'll get back to doing that at some future point. Independent individual donors, institutional funders in the private sector have the leeway to do that. Public funding is about being able to support the entirety of an ecosystem in unique ways. So how can public agencies democratize funding and influence support for BIPOC organizations and continue to capitalize on the positive trends that started to emerge during the past few years? Welcome. Any thoughts on this topic? I'd also ask Rebecca, do you have specific recommendations from your practice that you'd be willing to share?
I do. They're a little bit more general than the ones on democratization of funding. Do we want to see, does anyone want to share a thought on that? And then maybe I can dive into some sort of broader recommendations for funding as a whole.
Maybe we dive in broad first
Dive
and
in
then
broad?
circle back,
Okay,
give
let's
people
do
a
it.
chance to
Let's
think
do it.
through.
So
Okay.
I have some slides. So represented here on this slide and then on the next one is the advice that I give to foundations across the country who participate in a workshop series that I present with grant makers in the arts. And so as I go through these general recommendations, I'd invite each of you to consider whether any of this can be adapted to you as a government agency. During the pandemic, many of what I call pretty bad best practices were thrown out the window. Funders rushed to get money out the door as efficiently, as supportively as possible. And partly as a result, we saw the sector become quite well capitalized on a temporary basis. And so we're now really asking the funding community to think about why those rules existed in the first place and how we can avoid bringing them all back. The first one is this tendency to make gifts overly short-term and restrictive. Right? I'm giving you this grant, but you can only use it to pay for your core project activities. And here's a little dollop for your overhead, but that's the best we can do. The problem here is that when project funds don't contribute to the full costs of administrative staff, infrastructure, systems, the unintended consequence is that the institution is put at risk, right? And that when the institution is put at risk, so are the various projects within it. And so we do encourage funders to, when they can, replace restricted below cost funding with longer term unrestricted grants, or when they can't, and many funders aren't in a position to do that, when they can't, ensure that project grants come with a generous allocation for indirect costs as defined by the organization. Another pretty bad best practice out there is penalizing organizations for doing well financially. Right? You're not needy anymore. You don't need my money. I'm going to go support someone else. And when supporters send this signal, unintentionally usually, what happens is that nonprofit executives set their sights right at break even, and then there's no money to build that working capital. There's no savings for a rainy day or to take care of an aging building. And what we see in our practice is that many nonprofits and their trustees have simply been conditioned over decades to budget to zero. They don't even know why anymore, but it's out of fear, right? Out of fear of being penalized for showing positive performance, even though we all know that surpluses are a sign of good management. And then the third, what I call pretty bad best practice, is when funders head for the exits after encouraging or seeding growth, right? I'm with you for a few years. I'd like to see you grow your programs or expand your facility footprint. And as a result, become more sustainable and then not need my money anymore. Unfortunately, the reality is that for most organizations, growth of any kind tends to lead to deficits, at least initially. It is likely to increase the dependency of organizations on institutional philanthropy as their costs rise before new revenue starts to come in the door. And so in this moment, right, we recommend that funders and nonprofits replace a growth mindset with a mindset that is focused on sustainable strategies for change. Some organizations, as we alluded to earlier, may need permission to be smaller. And so as funders, you can support planning to help organizations develop realistic strategies with business plans to show how they'll get there. You can support human capital in particular that's connected to raising more revenue. And you could be patient while recognizing, I think, that during a moment like this, risk and failure in some cases are just par for the course, right? A natural, even if unfortunate, part of a renewal cycle like the one that I think we find ourselves in right now. And then I just have some final recommendations that are very much geared towards funding organizations of color. The first thing we've been recommending to our institutional funding partners are to consider placing bigger bets on grantee-defined change among BIPOC groups in recognition that many of them have never received transformational funding before, that some may even be wary of spending resources that have historically been so fleeting in nature. We think that funders will need to go extra lengths to really signal real commitment. Everyone benefits from unrestricted grants, but organizations that support communities of color rely more on this kind of funding than other groups because they have less access to donor wealth and community wealth. And so as a result, there's not an easy or obvious exit as a funder of a BIPOC organization, right? There are fewer individuals to take out institutional philanthropy on the other side. Consider capacity building. We talked about the human capital crisis across the board, and it's worse for many organizations of color, particularly small ones. And I believe that once some of these organizations begin to pay equitable wages, begin to pay the many volunteers who are working for free for these organizations, that we will begin to see some of the financial trends that we've seen among non-BIPOC organizations where deficits become more prominent and cash levels start to go down once these organizations rightly begin to invest in the people that they've not been able to invest in for so long. And then given that, we encourage institutional donors to consider explicitly adding cash reserve funding to their grants, since this kind of money has historically mostly been provided to only the largest of mainstream cultural organizations. So, you know, these might not all apply to all of you, but in addition to funders, I know that many of you have influence in your communities that goes well beyond your own institution. And so this is just meant to be some food for thought, right, as you consider how to directly help or influence others in a position to directly help.
Thanks, Rebecca. I know we have just a couple of minutes left. We had a request of someone saying, we know you don't have a crystal ball, but what are we predicting for 2024? Jen, do you have any thoughts based on, you know, what you've seen in the data about where you think we may be headed?
You know, I think, thinking about employment data specifically, there's this continuation, this sort of major break in this continuation of slow growth in arts and culture employment. And so I would put money on that continuing, right? That the scale of the workforce and arts and culture organizations will continue to grow. It'll be interesting to see the extent to which it grows disproportionately and the extent to which it scales in a way that provides living wages to people. I think that's a place where I'm really hopeful to see some change towards perhaps even smaller employment levels, but sustainable pay. But I don't yet see indications of the sort of the ship turning in that direction.
And I'll just say that, you know, the caveat here is that most organizations that come to me for help are those that are in worse financial shape, right? That's the bottom 30% of the sector. But I'm seeing real grief and pain right now. The data we're observing in practice from 2023 and 2024 is far worse than the data from 2022. I'm seeing deficits that I've never seen in 20 years of doing this work, reflecting those rising costs and still very depressed earned revenue, primarily in the performing arts. So that's what I'm seeing now. And in the near future, I expect that to persist. I will also say, though, on a positive note, that we are seeing boards of directors, artistic leaders, and executive directors really come together and grapple creatively with what to do about this situation, and really exploring new business models. Do we need to leave our facility? Is there another way for us to develop new plays? Does it have to mean a big production on a big stage 6 times every season? And so I am seeing, as one would suspect from this very creative sector, a fair amount of creativity coming from a difficult place, of course.
You know, I concur. I think we are going to see more closings, quite honestly. You know, the working capital that was built up during the pandemic from, as Rebecca said, you know, not having to expend while doors were closed and having the exceptional government funding in particular, you know, people are burning through that at record rates, and they're not seeing the audiences come back. I think that the visual arts are doing much better than the performing arts. I think that, you know, craft fairs, outdoor activity, anything that has a more flexible business model. I think a huge factor right now is just the fact that people have changed their consumption behavior. They did during the pandemic. We changed habits, and so the idea of not being able to, you know, I would like to see theater. It's not up to me when I consume. You know, I don't get to curate my own experience. I have to be there. And if 8 o'clock isn't convenient for me, too bad. I don't get to see it. You don't have the same flexibility as you do with, you know, visual arts, where I can spend a half an hour, I can spend 3 hours, I can distance myself as I see fit. You know, there's just been a shift, and I think it's particularly difficult for performing arts organizations. Some of the ones that I think have been doing an outstanding job and have a lot to learn from are those who, you know, I've given the example before, like Dallas Black Dance Theater in Dallas, where they've done an incredible job of seizing technology as new revenue sources, both for corporate support, for arts education, for pay-per-view. They didn't provide anything free of charge in a virtual space during the pandemic. You know, others who gave up their space and are not burdened any longer with the fixed assets. You know, those who are, I'm not going to call it right sizing, but just learning how to live at a smaller size and to make sure that they are flexible, because, you know, we'd all like to think that the worst is behind us now, but we never know when another crisis may be looming. And so what are the organizations able to do now to prepare for a future time of crisis? I think communities still care about the arts, and that's a very positive, thing. It's organizations understanding how to meet those needs. It's sobering, yes, but it's also, I think, a very healthy thing not to bury our heads in the sand and pretend that it isn't happening. And I think that the state agencies have so much influence and so much respect and are essential for the health of the sector within the states, that your leadership is really going to play a large role in helping the organizations that are able to survive do so in a way that makes them sustainable in the long term.
I want to